start with this hour's developing story, that news of a historic Middle East peace deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. They've agreed to normalise relations under a US brokered deal. Only two Arab nations, Egypt and Jordan, have previously signed peace deals with Israel. White House officials say that as part of the agreement, Israel has agreed to suspend applying sovereignty to parts of the occupied West Bank that it had considered annexing. President Trump made the announcement from the Oval Office a short while ago. Let's have a listen to what he said.
After 49 years, Israel and the United Arab Emirates will fully normalize their diplomatic relations. They will exchange embassies and ambassadors and begin cooperation across the board and on a broad range of areas, including tourism, education, healthcare, trade, and security. This is a truly historic moment. Not since the Israel-Jordan peace treaty was signed more than 25 years ago has so much progress been made towards peace in the Middle East. By uniting two of America's closest and most capable partners in the region, something which said could not be done, this deal is a significant step towards building a more peaceful, secure, and prosperous Middle East.
President Trump speaking a short time ago. Let's speak to our State Department correspondent, Barbara Plett-Usher, who is in Washington for us. This is quite a turn-up, Barbara, because it would seem that even the Palestinians didn't know that much about these negotiations, though they suspected they were going on.
Yeah, it is quite an historic moment, and it's interesting how things have developed. As you said, even the Palestinians didn't seem to know about it. We did know, of course, that the Israelis had been improving relations with their Gulf neighbors over the course of the past few years, including under-the-table sort of cooperation, especially against Iran, which they found to be a common, which they saw as a common enemy. But the Arab countries, the UAE amongst them, were reluctant to come above the radar as long as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had not been settled. And then what happened is that the Israeli Prime Minister began to say he was going to annex parts of the occupied West Bank. And in quite an unusual move, the U.S. ambassador to the UAE made a very public appeal to the Israelis. He had an article printed in the Hebrew press. He also sent a video in which he said, if you do this, we will not be able to move forward in any sort of normalization, because that will basically put an end to the two-state solution, and Arab states can't make peace with you if you do that to the Palestinians. So it's clear in this agreement that this is the compromise that the Trump administration has worked out, that the Israelis have suspended, not canceled, plans to annex parts of the West Bank, and in response, they will have full normalization with the United Arab Emirates. Although, if you look at the statement that came from the UAE embassy, they are framing it very much as a way to save the two-state solution. They said, look, this has stopped annexation plans. It has saved chances for the two-state solution. Now that we will have full normal relations with Israel, we'll use that approach to push for Palestinian rights. I think probably that will not go down all that well with the Palestinians, because they've always talked against this kind of approach by Israel to make separate peace with Arab states before their conflict is resolved. But this is a really big breakthrough for Israel. This is the way they want to do it, to have those peace agreements state by state, rather than resolving their conflict with the Palestinians first and then having a regional peace, which has been the framework until now. And clearly this is the approach the Trump administration wants and has been pursuing as well. And if you look at the statements from Mr. Trump and also from the Secretary of State, they're saying they're hoping this is the first of several agreements along these lines, and that it was achieved through various vigorous diplomatic activity.
OK, Barbara Plett-Usher there in Washington, thank you very much for that. Let's cross to Dubai and speak to our correspondent, Samir Hashmi, who has been listening in on a press conference there in Abu Dhabi. What did we hear from the United Arab Emirates in that press conference, Samir?
I think it was pretty much, it was the foreign minister of the UAE who was addressing that press conference. I couldn't go through it completely, but basically he was reiterating that this is a historic deal, and it is in the benefit of not just the UAE and Israel, but also for the peace in the region, especially when it comes to Palestine. The point that Barbara was making, that this really saves the two-state solution. It gives some kind of a hope, because once they have normal ties with Israel, they can look for a political solution when it comes to the Palestinian issue. But at the same time, It's also important to note that Israel and UAE have been working together in some form or the other, though they didn't have direct ties, but they've been warming up to each other for the last few years, and especially what we have seen since President Trump came into office, the ties between the United States and the two leading Gulf nations, which is Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have improved, and they enjoy a very strong relationship. So that's also played a key role in terms of brokering this deal. What's going to be interesting, though, is, which I think everyone's looking for clarity, I haven't got a confirmation, but will the UAE go ahead and open an embassy in Jerusalem before Israel and Palestine are able to arrive at a solution or a deal? I think that's the thing that a lot of Arab countries, at least the Gulf countries, will look out for, because it is the first Gulf country to strike a peace deal with Israel. But they've always been saying all this while, even when there were signs of things improving between the two countries, that the Palestinian solution is their topmost priority. But there were, I mean, if you look at just 4 months ago, UAE had sent an aircraft to Israel. It was the first flight to go between the two countries in so many decades. It was carrying aid for the Palestinians. Then when the UAE launched its Mars mission, which was just 3 weeks ago, Israel openly came out and congratulated the United Arab Emirates for that achievement, because it was the first Arab country to send a mission to Mars, even though Israel has been the leader when it comes to space exploration in this region. So there were signs, but no one really expected a deal. So in that sense, it's come as a big surprise.
What will the Arab League make of this? What will Saudi Arabia make of this? Because presumably they haven't been working in a vacuum here. The UAE must have been talking to Riyadh.
Absolutely. I don't think this deal must have gone through without Riyadh being on board, because if you look at the ties between the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, they're quite close. They've been working together on all the key issues, whether it's Yemen, Iran, Qatar. So the UAE has stood with Saudi Arabia when it comes to all these big decisions that have, or big moves that have taken place in the region over the last few years. But what's going to be interesting to see is now, when the Obama administration pushed through the Iran deal in 2015, the UAE was not directly consulted. And there was a feeling over here that they should have. And now with this deal with Israel, a lot of experts will tell you that this has really strengthened the UAE standing within the region. And and the big if is what happens in November with the elections, and if there is a scenario where you have a new president coming in and the United States tries to reset the relationship with Iran in some form or another, the UAE will be on that table. If a decision is made or what kind of a deal is presented, they will have a say in it. So this deal is definitely going to strengthen their position in the region, but they'll have to tread this very carefully, because of course the Palestinian issue is still a very sensitive one in this part of the world. And even though there's a push to normalize ties with Israel, they cannot be seen as aligning with them at the cost of ignoring the Palestinian cause. So it's going to be tricky. And what we need to look out for is the UAE if they're going to open an embassy in Jerusalem before there's a deal between Israel or Palestine, or some kind of solution on that front.
But just in very practical human terms, Muslims being able to travel, to fly to Tel Aviv, to go to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, tourism in Israel, trade between these two countries, I mean, that's an extraordinary breakthrough.
Absolutely. It's an extraordinary breakthrough. Muslims being able to travel to Al-Aqsa to pray, that's a huge, very significant, because remember, if you talk about Islam, after the two holy mosques in Saudi Arabia, Al-Aqsa is probably the third most important mosque or place of worship for Muslims. So there are a lot of Muslims from this part of the world who want to travel via Tel Aviv, they've never been able to do that. They'll be able to do that. So from that point of view, it's significant. Economically, yes, the United Arab Emirates and Israel will gain hugely through formal economic ties, because both of them, especially for the UAE, because if you look at Abu Dhabi, they have oil, they have natural gas, they've been expanding, but they're also trying to diversify the economy, especially Dubai, where I'm right now. They don't have oil. They rely on trade, business travel, tourism, and Israel could be a big, big market for them in that sense. And vice versa, if the Arab countries or the Gulf countries, people from here can start traveling to Israel, it's going to be a big boost for them. And then if you look at space and the scientific community, they would be happy with this move, because the UAE has been trying to give a big push to the space sector. Israel has been a leader in that when it comes to space exploration, if these two can work together in some form, that could also be a possibility. You can't rule that out. So in that sense, there are a plethora of possibilities. And from that point of view, it is also very, very significant.
Samir, good to talk to you. Thank you very much for all that detail that you've given us today. Just to bring you some reaction from Egypt as well. Egypt's President Sisi expressing his appreciation for the UAE-Israel agreement. Of course, Egypt has a peace treaty already with Israel. Jordan, the other country in the region that has diplomatic relations with Israel. And in just under an hour, we are expecting to hear from the Israeli Prime Minister. Just to remind you, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will give his reaction live from Jerusalem, and we will bring you that as and when it happens.